Welcome back, everybody. Another video update for you on the latest going on in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So much to discuss, of course. I'm not going to be able to cover everything in a short amount of time, so I'm going to try to touch on some key issues and highlight a couple of geopolitical important sort of context to keep in mind in understanding what's going on and what you might be reading in some of the headlines. But first and foremost, let's discuss what is happening on the ground. Latest reports are explosions being heard in and around Kiev. The assault on Kiev continues. Russia does not control the city. Russia has not actually formally entered the city, but the latest reports do seem to indicate that a final assault on Kiev is underway. Now, the question of casualties is very interesting because the latest reports, and if you're listening to US U.S. military analysts, then you would know that Russia has been stymied. Russia is not going as quickly. This operation is not going as smoothly as was expected. Now, whether or not that's simply U.S. war propaganda or if that's actually true is probably of secondary importance. I think what's most important now is that into day two and headed into day three, Russia has not secured what seems to be clearly the prime objective here, and that is to control the city or depose the government or do both of those things simultaneously, or however you want to look at it. They haven't been able to do that. And every minute, every hour that goes by is increasingly bad, both in terms of PR, obviously, for Russia, but in terms of actual military strategy. The longer this goes on, the more difficult it's going to be to extricate the military out of there without significant damage. Now, what kind of damage might we be looking at? Well, it really depends on how much you trust chatter that you find in Telegram and on social media and official Russian outlets and a combination thereof. Now, I've heard reports of up to 2,000 to 3,000 Russian soldiers dead already. I have absolutely no way of confirming that, and I can make no guarantees on the accuracy of that number. But if anything close to that number is actually accurate, well, you're looking at significant losses. I would say significantly higher than what the Russians would have anticipated less than 48 hours into this campaign. One of the things that I saw that might bolster this idea of mass casualties on the Russian side was something else that was circulating on social media. Again, I can't say if this is true, if this is completely fabricated. That's part of the sort of wild west nature of the information landscape in social media these days. But if it is true, this document was circulated in Russia and it was from the Ministry of Health directing all doctors and all medical facilities in Russia to prepare to be essentially drafted by the Ministry of Health for the purposes of, quote, a major medical event. Now, it depends on how you look at it and how you want to read into it. I think the most logical conclusion one could draw, assuming this is a real document, is the fact that the Russians did not anticipate these numbers of casualties, and now they need to get logistics in place to be able to handle the influx of these casualties. That seems to be the obvious reading. It could potentially be part of a psychological warfare operation. It could be preparing the Russian domestic political, sort of domestic audience for what amounts to a very different kind of political messaging than what Putin and company were offering up until this point. I can't really say for certain. What I can tell you is that the tenor and the language that is being used both domestically in Russia and in terms of, from Russia watchers seems to be that the mood is shifting, right? That there is a growing unease about the position that Russia finds itself in. And I think this is really kind of a good jumping off point to talk about the most important, I would say, political developments today, which, and again, I'm recording here in the evening of February 25th, Friday, February 25th, here in the United States on the East Coast. Um, was the announcement from a bunch of different news sources that the Chinese have basically told the Russians that they need to engage in negotiations with Zelensky and the Ukrainian government. Xi Jinping has more or less made it clear that Putin needs to negotiate his way out of this, that this needs to come to an end. Now, the reason that Xi Jinping can do this is not because Putin likes to play second fiddle. I think we can all probably agree that Putin doesn't want to play second fiddle to anybody. And by the way, we should also note that there is a tremendous amount of anti Chinese kind of racist sentiment that is quite rampant in Russian society and cultural attitudes toward the Chinese. So the idea that Russia would be subordinate to China is one of the principal obstacles to the sort of blossoming of this Russia China alliance that has been talked about for a long time. But anyway, I don't want to go into the sort of Russian chauvinism aspect of it, but that is part of the issue and it should be discussed. And of course, the Kremlin apologists and propagandists and others would never discuss the idea that how dare one suggest that Russia has a deeply racist view of China and Chinese people. Well, of a lot of different people, but that's probably for another day. So the issue of Xi Jinping basically ordering Putin to negotiate here. How can he do this? How should we understand this? Putin is not in a subordinate role. However, Putin has put himself into a bind, and the Chinese are really the only power in the world that can do anything to underwrite what Putin basically needs them to do, which is to basically help him out of here economically and politically, to provide him cover, to mediate, as it were. This is going to raise some very interesting questions. First of all, Ukraine has for quite a while been seen by the Chinese as an integral part of the Belt and Road Initiative. That is the One Belt, One Road Chinese economic development model, which basically sees Chinese capital as expanding Chinese power through development deals on infrastructure and other things all over the world, but particularly in Asia and increasingly into Southern and Eastern Europe. Greece has been courted by the Chinese for quite a long time, Ukraine as well. The Chinese were looking at Ukraine in many ways as sort of, yet another avenue to get Chinese exports to European markets. So the Chinese have a vested interest in Ukraine, or I shouldn't say vested, but they have a very definite interest in Ukraine. And they have a definite interest, of course, in both simultaneously helping and cornering Putin. This is part of the sort of, on again, off again friendship rivalry between Russia and China, which is so interesting when you consider just how close they've gotten in relation to Washington, as Washington and sort of the imperial apparatus has become ever more volatile, specifically, in the post Trump years, or in the Trump and post Trump years. Anyway, this relationship is particularly interesting when you look at it in the context of not only Ukraine, but also Kazakhstan. Remember, the Russians sent military into Kazakhstan last month. I mean, that was really only 6 weeks ago or 7 weeks ago that the Russian military went quickly into Kazakhstan to essentially put down protest by force, or at least secure the critical infrastructure that was necessary to the oligarchs in order for them and their thugs to be able to put down the workers' uprising in Kazakhstan. So Russia has kind of exerted military force within the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the CSTO, its sort of mini NATO that it has established. And what we see is that the Russian military basically is used to bail out oligarchs in Kazakhstan. Those oligarchs, many of them have been enriched by Chinese investments in a country that is very much, as far as the people go, very anti China and anti Russia. Culturally, the people of Kazakhstan look much more to Turkey than they do to China or to Russia. So here's a country where Russia uses its military force just last month, exercises that level of dominance in the country, physical dominance, where they can actually change events on the ground with a very small military force. And yet, here we are, 6 weeks later, Putin goes to Kazakhstan and asks that government that he just propped up, that he just prevented from being toppled, asks them to participate in a war in Ukraine, and they tell him no. How is anybody going to tell me that Putin has somehow masterminded himself into some stroke of geopolitical genius here? The man has used his military in a country in the center of Asia, and he can't even get the leaders of that country to back him in a war on his own border the following month. It's actually pretty remarkable just how much Putin has sort of undermined his own credibility, his own public image. I'm almost shocked how quickly it's happened because at least for a long time now, for a number of years, Putin has had this reputation of being, like I said, some kind of geopolitical grand chess grandmaster or something. Now, as I mentioned about Kazakhstan and Turkey, this is very, very, very interesting because Turkey plays a central role in everything that is happening in this region. Now, Turkey, in its sort of neo Ottoman foreign policy, which is what Erdogan has been promoting for 15 years at least, this neo Ottoman view of Turkish influence, which essentially sees Turkey as an imperial power, a regional imperial power, whose influence stretches from Turkey eastward all the way to basically Western China to Xinjiang to the Uyghur people, who are a Turkic people whose indigenous language is a Turkic language belonging to that sort of linguistic family. So it's very interesting that in Kazakhstan, Russia's military, Chinese investments, and Turkish cultural influences sort of come together in this strange confluence, and yet the oligarchs that just got bailed out by Putin won't come to aid him. What does that tell you about his position? What does that tell you about Erdogan's position? Erdogan now leads a country that is not only competing with Russia in a variety of ways in Africa with the mercenaries and the drones and everything else, but also even in Russia's own backyard in the Black Sea. Turkey is now exploring for gas in the Black Sea. Turkey is moving into the Eastern Mediterranean. Turkey is essentially moving in everywhere that it sees cracks in Russia's influence, soft power and hard power. And this is probably nowhere more apparent than in Ukraine. Let's not forget that the day that Putin gave a very important press conference in the weeks leading up to this war, that very day, Erdogan signed a deal with Zelensky to build a Turkish drone facility outside of Kiev. Now, I mean, this is not coincidence. This is not by accident. This is Erdogan sending a shot right across Putin's bow, basically telling him that if Ukraine is up for the taking, I'm getting my piece. And I mean, considering what Turkey is, namely a NATO member, and specifically a country that has regional imperial ambitions and NATO to back it up, this is a very dangerous proposition for Russia because it is essentially not just confronting the United States NATO, or rather NATO in the form of the United States with Biden and the US domestic politics and all of the complications and question marks that come with that. But it is also facing down Erdogan and sort of the Turkish side of the NATO alliance. It's a really fascinating overlap of this sort of imperial rivalry. And this is what I keep saying is that for those of you of my generation or even older, maybe, who have come to see the post Cold War world as a single global imperial power dominating the globe and essentially making a worldview for us in which opposition to empire was de facto opposition to a single global imperial power, the United States. And now what we're looking at is this kind of sub imperial competition, competing imperialisms, as it were, as I keep saying. That is what you're now seeing in the Black Sea with Turkey and Russia. That is what we're seeing in Central Asia with Turkey, Russia, and China. This is going to continue on, and this is actually going to be one of the defining conflicts of the coming decades, I believe. Now, as I said, Xi Jinping tells Russia to negotiate with Ukraine. He's giving Russia an out here. This is going badly for Putin. The Russian economy is going to get hit. The banks are now scrambling, both for scenarios in which they're frozen out of the SWIFT debt settlement system, but also for sanctions that could potentially prohibit the major Russian banks from settling international financial transactions. There is quite a lot. Now, the Black Sea, and I know I'm already at 15 minutes, so I'm going to have to wrap it up here. The Black Sea is a very interesting theater of conflict here because NATO isn't some innocent bystander in all of this. I think we should be very clear that NATO is absolutely an aggressor here. When Putin says that NATO is aggressive and threatens Russia's borders, this is fundamentally, from a military perspective, correct. The United States carries out annual naval drills in the Black Sea with Ukraine and with other Black Sea countries that are ultimately provocative if you're a Russian imperialist who sees the Black Sea as, your sort of bathtub, your backyard, or what have you, right? But I mean, ultimately, if you're Russia, you sort of see these as aggressive maneuvers, no question. But the truth is that the Black Sea is up for grabs. And it's not so much the United States, although the US naval assets do go there. It really is Turkey that seems to be making the most moves in the Black Sea. We see Turkey, as I mentioned, they're already exploring for energy in the Black Sea. And of course, this all comes back to Turkey's connections to Caspian energy, Azerbaijan specifically, but also a lot of the pipelines that come from the Caspian go through this region and ultimately feed Europe with energy. All of these pipeline politics figure into these questions as well. Um, Now, I want to just quickly note as well that it's not just energy in the Black Sea. A lot of global trade goes through there, a lot of agricultural output, a lot of agricultural exports that are coming from Russia and from Ukraine have to traverse through the Black Sea. If you have an actual Russia Turkey conflict, the Black Sea is going to become probably one of the central sort of battlegrounds here, whether it's just in a geopolitical sense or even in the literal sense of the word. We are in a very dangerous position now as we kind of see these competing powers beginning to jockey in ways that I think 5 years ago even were sort of unimaginable. So anyway, as I'm going to close the discussion here, it is 10:40 in the evening on the East Coast on February 25th. And my thoughts are with Ukraine. I mean, my thoughts are with Odessa, the city of my father and my grandfather and the father side of my family. My thoughts are with people who have loved ones who are in Ukraine. Um, my thoughts are also with the many generations that came before me that lived in that part of the world, people, ancestors of mine that I didn't know, some of whom were murdered by Nazis, some of whom were murdered by various thugs, some of whom just got erased from history. And there's a connection to this place, and I feel a sort of personal connection to this issue. And I just I know that I'm not alone in that. I know that there are a lot of people who feel that way, and certainly a lot of people feel that way about a lot of conflicts around the world. But this one somehow, I wasn't expecting it, and I know a lot of other people weren't. And we're all going to try to make our way through it and understand it the best we can, and hopefully I can help you in whatever way I can. All right. If you like this work, please go to Patreon, patreon.com/Eric Draitser, patreon.com/ERIC DRAITSER. A lot more commentaries like this one and a lot more content there. So please do go there if you like it, and talk to you soon.